What's up, guys? Kyle here from KR Performance Coaching with the first of hopefully many more sit-down educational style videos based on topics that I've had questions about or things that I just think most people should understand when it comes to either training, nutrition, or just general health and fitness advice. So in the gym earlier in the week, having a conversation with one of the guys that trains at the same gym as me, obviously, and we got into a bit of a conversation about program design, setting up your session, and what sort of sequencing should you do with your workouts. So should you do your heavy exercises first, or should you do light exercises first? So the typical sort of framework for that would be heavy compound movements first, or more pre-exhaust style program where you would do like an isolation exercise first, and then move into your more compound exercises. So I guess what I wanted to do today was really dive into that topic a little bit deeper, give you guys an understanding of the positives, the negatives of both of those things, and then maybe some practical applications you can take away so you can get the most out of your training. So when it comes to heavy or light work first, there are a few things we need to understand. So common practice is that we would generally put like the heavier, like meat and potato, multi-joint compound movements first in a workout. So they obviously have the highest technical component in terms of your ability to execute them. So if we think like, barbell bench press, back squat, deadlift, all those movements are very technical. So you need to be good at the actual movement to be able to perform them effectively and stay injury free. So that's typically a consideration for putting the heavy stuff first in that workout. So reducing the risk of injury is probably a big one for most people. So with those big compound, meat and potato movements, they generally require more stability. So a thought for putting those first in the workout is if you're moving into those compound movements, fresh, it's your first exercise, maybe you've done some warm-up sets on that movement, you go into that as your first exercise. The idea is that you're not fatigued, you're not carrying any fatigue into that movement, so your ability to stabilize under heavy load is far better, which again is a tick for injury prevention in the long run. So the next point is these types of movements are more, bang for your buck. So if you don't know what that means, just, you get the most out of the least. So say for example, you're doing a squat, it doesn't just train like your quads, where maybe a leg extension just trains your quads. We've got a squat that kind of trains like a bit of the quads, we get a bit of the glutes, we get lots of adductors, we get some low back, we get some erectors. So we kind of train a lot of, muscle groups with, direct emphasis on the legs, obviously, but we get a fair bit of volume sort of tacked onto those other muscle groups. So we get, more bang for our buck, basically. So, the flip side of that sort of, idea or concept is that, when we look at a program or when we look at what we're trying to achieve, we want to sort of give priority in our workout. So we want to give priority to the first movements, obviously, to the areas that we want to build or grow. Now, that sort of means like if you want to grow your shoulders, you train your shoulders first in the workout, obviously. But maybe, heavy compound movements for, let's say, rear delts or biceps or triceps or forearms or calves or whatever, they're not necessarily going to be big, heavy compound movements that you need to use in order to train those muscles. So if we want to build up those smaller single joint, sort of muscle groups, we're not necessarily going in and doing like a super heavy barbell curl or, really heavy like calf raises for 6 reps. It just wouldn't be productive. So a tick for the box in terms of going in and doing those isolation movements first, or pre-exhaust if we want to call it that, is that we can prioritize individual muscle groups. We obviously need to choose exercises appropriately if we want to bring up those lagging body parts, for example. So pre-exhausting, if you're not familiar with the term pre-exhaust, is basically just using an isolation exercise first in your workout before you go on to those heavy, meat and potato compound movements. So a case for pre-exhausting whether you sort of have it in your programming all the time or you use it sporadically in different training cycles, is when you go into your heavy compound movements after you've done your first isolation movement. So say, for example, we're training the chest, we do some, cable flies first, we really fire up the pecs, we just use those pecs to get the cable flies done, so we get a lot of stimulus, a lot of local fatigue. When we move onto our, say, barbell bench press or incline bench press or dumbbell press, we know for certain that the intended muscle group becomes the limiting factor. So when we move into that heavy exercise, the pecs are already stimulated, so they're the thing that are going to fail first, or at least get the most stimulus, compared to maybe moving into your heavy exercise first. Because we know that, most people would know if you go to the gym, right, you can let the ego take over a little bit. If you go in, you do your heavy barbell exercise first, like your pecs get some stimulation obviously, but the triceps get heaps, the anterior delts get heaps. And then if we get too cocky and we start using momentum, we start getting a lot of leg drive, we reduce range of motion by, using that powerlifting style bench, then we kind of miss the forest for the trees in the sense that we're not getting actual stimulus to the chest, we're getting stimulus everywhere with maybe some stimulus on the chest. So a little tick in the box of pre-exhaust or isolation exercises first, and then moving into the compound, we do get a lot more directed stimulus to those intended muscle groups. So the last point I want to bring up is I guess in terms of the ego factor or ego lifting. When it comes to building muscle, and I think the majority of people who will watch this video and the majority of people that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, my coaching group or PT clients or whatever it might be, their number one goal is to look better, feel better. So to make that happen, we need to build muscle, right? So I think too many people, especially in the commercial gym setting, get carried away, letting that ego factor take over, like, oh, how much you bench, bro? And that's their whole focus for that session is I got to bench 3 plates because, old mate did it next to me. When in reality, it's like, that's not necessarily the thing that's going to grow your chest the most. So I think it's, in terms of exercise selection or at least program design, it's picking the right tool for the job and not just doing dumb shit because someone else did it or it makes you feel cool. Because at the end of the day, like, the goal of hypertrophy or the way we achieve hypertrophy or muscle growth is directing stimulus to muscle tissue. It's not necessarily how much you can bench press or how much you can squat. The muscles don't necessarily understand how much you lift or do they care. They're just, are they getting adequate stimulus with the right exercises? So when can pre-exhaust or isolation movements first be beneficial? So when should you use it, or what might be an ideal circumstance to put it in your program? So lighter work first can be particularly useful at improving sensation in a target muscle group. So I might use the example of like RDLs. So a lot of the times people who don't maybe understand how to do RDLs correctly, and they obviously need to work on technique first. But if we want to go in and we want to, number one, we want to avoid injury, and number two, we want to direct stimulus to tissue, isolation or pre-exhaust exercises or work first can be a good way to kind of fire up the muscle group or the intended muscle groups that we want to train, so that when we move into those compound meat and potato movements, we can actually feel the muscles that we're trying to work. So, maybe someone goes in, they're a beginner, they don't really understand how to load the hamstrings properly or hip hinge properly. By going in and maybe doing, some really fixed machine-based work, like a leg curl, lying, seated, kneeling, whatever they have available, they can obviously feel the hamstrings working, so that they're already sort of obviously, creating some localized fatigue, they're getting some stimulus to the hamstrings. When they move on to that heavy barbell compound, RDL or dumbbell RDL, barbell, whatever they end up doing, they can actually feel the hamstrings for one. So they have the ability to kind of get a bit of that mind-muscle connection in terms of, hey, this exercise should be training my hamstrings. I can feel my hamstrings, and not necessarily get carried away with, again, ego lifting or lifting too heavy just for the sake of doing it, but actually giving adequate stimulus to those hamstrings. So another case that this can be useful in, and this is, I guess, apparent now to a couple of my clients that I'm dealing with who are at the pointy end of, their dieting phase for a contest prep, the risk of injury, dramatically increases the deeper you get into a contest prep, purely based on the fact that fatigue, like cumulative fatigue from, long-term dieting, long-term training, all these sort of factors that build up when you're contest prepping, we want to reduce the risk of injury, because obviously if you injure yourself, you can't go and compete, right? You kind of fall short of the mark. So we want to try and keep these people as injury free as possible. And the way we can do that is obviously, not getting carried away with, trying to do really heavy movements, obviously, but limiting the ability to kind of, hurt themselves with those movements. So all we can do is shift the priority. So if the majority of our, training cycles, let's say we've got 3 training cycles, 12 weeks, long for a prep, we've got 3 4-week cycles, maybe, 2/3 of those training cycles are heavy meat and potato compound movements when there's still some calories, when fatigue isn't too high. But as we get to that pointy end, that last 4 weeks, maybe it's a good idea to deprioritize those heavy movements and kind of bring those, isolation exercises in first, because A, we're getting lots more stimulus to the target muscle group, the intended muscle group that we're, trying to at least maintain or grow. And then B, once we deprioritize those heavy movements, the risk of injury goes down because absolute load goes down. And, if you've ever tried it in the gym before, again, using like the RDL as the example, if you go and do a set of RDLs fresh, you might do some, warm-up sets, empty bar, 20, 100, 120, whatever it might be. You can get pretty heavy, right? If you're in that sort of 6 to 12 rep range. Whereas if you went and did lying leg curls first, you're going to build up a lot of metabolites in the hamstring. You're going to build up a lot of localized fatigue, so that when you go into that RDL, your hamstrings are pretty fried already. And, hamstrings are a good example because they actually don't need a lot of volume, and they, get pretty good stimulus from not a lot of work. So when you go and do those leg curls, going into the RDL, your risk of injury goes all the way down because you're already fatigued, you've got a lot of metabolites there, you're not going to be able to lift as heavy. So our risk of injury goes way down. The next case could potentially be during a, we'll call it like a light phase or a metabolite phase or whatever you want to call it, where the absolute load is less, the reps are a lot higher. So again, we're not lifting super heavy. Maybe the pre-exhaust or the light, isolation exercises first make more sense, because we're not going to, again, let the technique become an issue where, say for example, if you've ever done really high rep squats, obviously they really fuck you up, but B, sometimes the lower back or the upper back, erectors, elbows start getting a bit sore and tired before your quads actually get, good stimulus. So maybe doing a leg extension first, we really fire up the quads, we get a lot of good stimulus, a lot of metabolites build up in the quads, so that when we go into squats, we know that, hey, my quads are fried already, I'm not going to need heaps of work to stimulate them, and then, that's not going to affect my lower back, my upper back, or whatever it might be. So the idea of using it in maybe a metabolite or lighter phase is, number one, obviously we're reducing risk of injury again, but number two, it can be a good way to reduce, I guess, issues that arise with tendons, joints, ligaments, all that type of stuff if we're doing lots of heavy movements. So again, if we look at that 12-week training cycle, 3 4-week phases, we want sort of 2/3 of our training to be productive within that sort of 6 to 12, 6 to 15 rep range. It's going to be pretty heavy overloading movements. It's going to be very, taxing on the joints, the tendons, the ligaments over the long term. So if we've got sort of 8 weeks of really heavy, hard training, we want to kind of back off that stimulus a little bit. Maybe use a metabolite phase where we're looking at, say, 12 reps to maybe 30 reps in somewhere in that range. We can use more of these techniques like pre-exhaust or just isolation exercises first to really give the joints and tendons and all those structures a break before we move on to our next sort of 8 weeks of heavy, hard training. So the last one is probably, again, like I know I'm harping on injury management, but I think it's very important for people, to be able to have a long career in the gym. We can use like these pre-exhaust or light isolation exercises first if someone has an injury. So if you have like an actual injury, you've hurt yourself in the gym, doing like heavy overloading barbell or compound movements just doesn't make sense at all, or at least in the sense of doing it heavy. So you might go into the gym and you might use, for example, like blood flow restriction training, where we know the adaptations we get from blood flow restriction training are similar to that of, heavy overloading normal training with far less load. We obviously just have to do more reps. So we could use, for example, a pre-exhaust exercise or a light isolation exercise with the blood flow restriction bands. Get lots of stimulus, lots of metabolite buildup, which is a mechanism of hypertrophy. Before we go and do, say, for example, some more compound in nature movements, maybe like a leg press or lunge or something like that, where again we're reducing overall load, so it's not as taxing on maybe the joint structures or the ligaments, tendons, or even muscles, because we've already accumulated a lot of stimulus in that sort of first exercise. So what are some of the drawbacks? Like, what cases does this not make sense, or what are potentially the limitations with using pre-exhaust or isolation exercises first? So you obviously have to lift significantly less load. So in the case of long-term training progression and muscle growth, obviously volume load is the thing we want to look at. So we want to progressively lift, potentially heavier loads for more volume over time. So with the isolation stuff being in place, it means we have to lift less load over time. So maybe it's useful in the short term, like we said, maybe that 2-to-1 paradigm of heavy hard training, some light isolation, pre-exhaust, metabolite stuff, but then the majority of our training just reverts back to that heavy hard overloading training. So the next drawback is sort of moving onto those heavy compound movements, under fatigued conditions. So stability then becomes a big issue, and again, injury management, but bear with me, it'll make sense. You can see where problems might arise if you were to go do, balls to the wall, leg extensions, 15, 20 reps, something like that, and then move on to a heavy barbell back squat. Your quads are already fatigued, so you're going to be moving into an exercise that requires precise technique, requires like ultimate stability, but your legs are fucked. So you can see where the issue of potential injuries can occur with that stability, factor coming in. So I would err on the side of caution with this, and I guess this is where, I might talk about this in my next point, but this is where your choice of exercise is critical in, circumventing that issue of stability and barbell compound movements. The last one is the potential to kind of blow out your session duration and blow out your volume targets, I guess, per session and then per week. Because like we said before, those barbell movements are sort of bang for your buck. So when we squat, we get lots of, stimulus to lots of muscles, where if we do just leg extensions, we just train, rectus femoris, a bit of VMO, like just the quads. So in order to get enough volume for our, overall leg development, we'd then need to go do, we'd have leg extensions, then we'd need to maybe do some leg press, then we'd need to go do hamstring curls, then we need to do some adductors, then we'd also need to do some glutes. So you can see like it's already, 6 exercises to kind of achieve the same thing that you would get from a squat, with maybe some emphasis on different areas, to kind of fill the gaps in terms of what you don't get. So I think there's a case for using it, but you also need to bear in mind that it can sort of blow out overall volume and session duration. What are some considerations and some practical takeaways that you can apply to your own training? So exercise selection is critical when it comes to maybe using pre-exhaust, whether you do it as a pre-exhaust superset or just isolation exercises before compounds, because of what we said about the stability factor. So if you were to do lots of high rep, hard work, leg extensions before you go onto your compound movement, I would have a squat variation as your next movement, but it might not necessarily be a squat. You could use something like a hack squat, which you're stable, you're locked in. There's not many things that can go wrong. You might look at like a leg press, or you might look at maybe a split squat with arms supported. So we can still get the stimulus of a squat without stability becoming an issue. So the same sort of rule applies for majority of muscle groups, just to give you some examples. So like if you did lateral raises first in your workout, instead of doing like heavy dumbbell presses next, you might go into a Smith machine press, where again, stable, locked in, or a machine plate loaded press. If you were going on to, let's say, hamstrings, you might do hamstring curls first, then instead of maybe heavy deadlifts, you might do dumbbell RDLs, or you might do hip thrusts, or you might do some back extensions, movements that you're pretty stable and safe. I guess the point to kind of wrap this whole thing up is it's important to always train the muscle groups earlier in your workout that you want to give priority. And how you choose to do that is kind of, I know it's a bit of an ambiguous answer, but it's the way that makes most sense to you. So we want to obviously utilize pre-exhaust or isolation exercises at certain periods of our training, cycles or our mesocycles, but we want to use them appropriately where stability doesn't become an issue. So my advice would be opt for maybe more compound machine-based movements in this training phase, and then when you go back to your sort of heavy overloading, majority of your training cycles, then that's where I would cycle in maybe your more compound barbell free weight movements, so like your deadlifting, your squat, your pressing, overhead press, and things like that. So when it comes to sort of planning these training cycles and how you should utilize these things best, I think injury management should be the first thing you need to think about, because if you get injured, throughout any of these training cycles, then everything is kind of thrown out the window and you can't do any of it. So when it comes down to it, really think about what you can do, sustainably. So what things can you manage in the long run, again, to get the most stimulus, but also to avoid injury. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, guys, peace out.